Mine said, hey, can you scoot over, please? Because I'm putting the chair. And he's like, what? Really? I'm like, can you move over, please? Almost got hood with him. He doesn't want to see me get mad. Huh? Yeah. Shit. I was talking to my dad because he wants me to go low.
Did you get your panties in a bunch a little bit?
What? Already.
Don't be.
This is it.
So there'll be somebody coming from media services in case there's anything else that you
Okay.
need.
So is there a computer plug into?
Usually it's already set up by now. I just got him. Susan was under the understanding that you were bringing one.
I did. I couldn't remember. I did bring one.
You had said you would.
Okay.
I can get one.
No, I guess I had it in my mind that there was just one here, but I brought one. So I maybe actually remembered what I said.
Discussed it. He said if you needed a book, you could send it.
Okay.
You are our first bring your own.
Okay.
First that you had.
There's a power credit behind you. And what we've done, if you want to use this for notes, are you a podium guy or are you more of a walker?
I
aren't
am,
you?
but I think I'll be pretty close to the podium today.
I like to do anyway. I like to have this piece for paper and just put that there. So, but that means since you didn't, if you were going to bring your own, then you didn't, did you bring your own clicker as well?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so did you already hook up the, oh good,
Yeah.
So they're going to come with a clicker for you. So, there's no interference between this mic and the lapel.
Okay.
So we recommend you just hook yourself up
Okay.
now, and then for Q&A, you can move and have no concern about
Great.
where you are. Mick has had a little bit of vertigo,
Okay.
but he will be doing your introduction today.
Okay.
Just so you know. in
Like
case
you
you're
had
trying
mentioned
to-
in your email.
So he will introduce you, and then at the end, he'll come up to do like a little announcement for next quarter,
Okay.
and to thank you. And what we've been doing is you field your own Q&A following.
Okay.
Are you
Sure.
good with
Oh,
that?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay. And just a little bit before 5 has been the good time to try to shoot for
things up.
to.
Okay.
Is that, how does that work? in
th-
your-
That
Okay.
should be fine. Is there a clock I can use? Or just on there? Okay. Maybe just sort of wave when
I
it's.
have been for people who requested it.
Okay.
I'll sit in that chair there, and I'll just hold my hand up like this to how you understand that.
Okay, great.
You look so different from your picture.
Susan, do you know Jen?
Hi, nice to meet you.
Oh, good.
Okay.
And then we also, did you bring a clicker for the,
Oh, PowerPoint? No, I can have someone bring it.
so I need that for his, he has his own laptop.
Oh, does he need one?
And I think you're all set with your laptop, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter.
I think we've got
okay.
this set up,
Hooked
so
up
we should be
here.
good to go.
You just need a clip
The
for that.
clicker.
Oh, okay.
Maybe you can just check though to make sure that we're all as we should be.
Okay. Okay, let me call them.
Okay, great.
So, what's the toggle to get it just onto my
Oh,
screen?
do Windows P. And duplicate. Hi, Dan. We actually just need a wireless presenter up here. Okay. Yeah. someone's coming up with the wireless presenter. Would you like it clipped to your collar or your tie? Oh, here, let me log in. It'll go away when I log in.
Oh, is that it?
Do you want this clipped to your belt or in your pocket? And then I can clip this to your collar right there. That's fine.
The collar or the lapel of my jacket?
Oh, do you want regular jacket?
So should I come over my shoulder, do you think? Or just...
Did you just want it like right here?
Yeah.
Or do you want the other side?
Why don't we do the other side? That way it's not. Okay, great.
Just kind of into your pocket. So just
Oh. Thanks. Okay.
depends on your comfort. Ask the person, you repeat the question, or you could deliver a mic.
Okay.
Because we're videoing, we won't pick up the questions unless
Okay.
it's either rephrased by you or.
Right. Okay. So this is irrelevant now, or am I using that?
It's on.
Okay.
So that's why I chose the other way, but there's no interference, so you can, yeah.
Oops.
Restore credit.
Right.
That's me there, so you'll just see me.
Okay.
Anything else?
I don't think so.
Thank you for doing this on election day.
Yeah. It's kind of exciting.
Also know that it's streamed, so at the end, we'll want to turn off your mic.
Okay.
So that you know the post-conversation mingle
Okay, thank you.
is important.
Okay, so
And I'll come up to mute this one
Okay.
afterwards, because we
Great.
you just go forward, back,
Okay.
and you can walk around and hold it.
Okay. And then just one of them black out and go back up or not? You know,
Like,
does one of them make the screen black?
I'll put it in no. I guess
Yeah.
that one. Okay.
All right. Perfect.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Do you want to test that out? Did it advance okay?
Yes, it did. I think so. Yeah. it's just, you know, just the slide. At this point, it is what it is. No, I real just so like 100% out of it. I think I should figure out how to
Yeah, I know.
might
They'll be
undermine.
trying to that probably, yeah.
Would you prefer that I put it down?
Yeah, maybe let's put it on the table. Less likely to knock it over that way.
You know what? Putting it right back here so that I'm not.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 2012-2013 Bannan Institute Sacred Texts in the Public Sphere. My name is Mick McCarthy and I'm the Executive Director of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education here at Santa Clara University. The Ignatian Center is charged with promoting and enhancing the distinctively Jesuit Catholic tradition of education at SCU. Our vision is to become known throughout Silicon Valley and beyond as providing leadership for the integration of faith, justice, and the intellectual life. The Bannan Institutes provide for the university a range of events that address matters of significance to the Jesuit Catholic intellectual tradition, foster an ethic of dialogue among persons of diverse religious and philosophical commitments, and offer opportunities for exchange across the university and the broader community. The fall offerings have centered around the current national election. Inspired by what the newly inaugurated president usually appends to the oath of office, we begin this quarter with a series on sacred politics, So Help Me God, Scriptural Authority, and the Public Conscience. Appropriately, today is not only the election day, but the last of 6 Tuesday afternoons where we have been looking specifically at scriptural politics. We explore how Christian texts are used within public discourse to justify a range of position on issues of significant debate among the electorate. Today it's my pleasure to introduce our own Professor James Bennett from the Religious Studies Department of Santa Clara University. Prior to coming to Santa Clara in the year 2002, Professor Bennett taught at the University of Oklahoma. He earned his PhD in American Religious History at Yale University, and he holds also degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary, an MDiv, and a BA in English and American Studies from UCLA. Dr. Bennett is the author of Religion and the Rise of Jim Crow in New Orleans, published by Princeton University Press. He has also published articles on American Christianity and the intersection of religion and race in the United States. Professor Bennett also serves as an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. Professor Bennett's interest in religion in the United States makes him especially qualified to speak on today's topic. Despite the constitutional prohibition of a religious test for office, religion has long played an important role in presidential elections and in the American presidency itself. The 2012 presidential election marks a new chapter in that story, as the major party candidates represent a unique combination of religious affiliations in the U.S. electoral history. How have those identities shaped the candidates and the election, and what are the implications for the presidency of the winning candidate? We all hope to know who that winning candidate is really soon. As we await the results, please welcome Professor James Bennett, who will lecture on scriptural politics of the American presidency, religion in the 2012 presidential election. Jim.
Thank you, Mick, and to Teresa and Susan and everyone in the Ignatian Center who has made getting ready for this such an easy and comfortable process. I also want to acknowledge my students in RSOC 51, many of whom I see right here in the front, Religion in America. Our class normally meets at this time, so we've not been able to partake in this, but I've forced them to today, so thank you for making room for them. And I also want to acknowledge my students in RSOC 148, a seminar on religion and the presidency this quarter, who have not only graciously allowed me to test out some of my ideas with them, but in fact have been crucial contributors to some of the thoughts that I want to share with you. Presidential politics is a nasty business, and religion has long stood at the center of much of that nastiness, especially when the candidates and their supporters sense that so much rests on the outcome of the election. The consequences are often framed in religion in even cosmic terms. Take the election of 1800, for example. Typical of the inflamed rhetoric in that election season was a Philadelphia paper which suggested that voters needed to ask themselves, Shall I continue in allegiance to God and a religious president, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God? The paper likewise warned that voting for this audacious, howling atheist Jefferson put one's salvation at risk, for what can screen such wretches from the just vengeance of insulted heaven? The election of 1800 was a historic election, pitting John Adams, the sitting president, against Thomas Jefferson, the sitting vice president. Religion remained at the center of the heated political rhetoric. In ways familiar to us, over 2 centuries later, campaigners misrepresented the beliefs and the religious consequences of electing their opponent's candidate. Jefferson was unfairly attacked as an infidel and an atheist, though he was neither, and opponents stoked fears that skeptics and non-Christians would assume central places in his government. And so, as is often the case, Jefferson's opponents obsessed over one particular passage Jefferson had written in his notes in Virginia nearly 20 years earlier. In that small passage, he had written, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Clergy joined in the fray, publishing books such as The Voice of Warning to Christians in the ensuing election, insisting that no professed atheist, be his talents and acquirements what they may, ought to be promoted to the presidency, and warning that if Americans elected an enemy of Christ, it would be an awful symptom of the degeneracy of that nation. John Adams, his opponent, fared no better. On the one hand, he was a Unitarian from Boston, but he also worked closely with Congregationalist clergy to ensure New England would remain Christian and be governed by Christian leaders. He supported the state establishment, that is, taxes to support the Congregational church, and he supported a religious requirement for all office holders. Adams' opponents painted him an opponent of religious liberty and warned that he wanted to establish the Presbyterian Church as a national church. It seemed to have worked. As Adams claimed, the question of religious liberty took the election from him. Adams complained that opponents had said, "Let us have Jefferson, Madison, Burr, anybody, whether they be philosophers, deists, even atheists, rather than a Presbyterian president." That's for my Presbyterian friends, by the way. Evangelical support for Jefferson does seem to have swung the election against Adams' victory. It was an unholy alliance of evangelicals and deists on the margins cooperating to support the religiously unorthodox Jefferson against the religious establishment behind Adams. Did you catch that? The evangelicals and the deists and atheists were allies to support the Democratic Jefferson. The 1800 election remained trying right to the finish. The Electoral College produced no clear winner, throwing the election into the House of Representatives, which took votes 36 times before finally electing Jefferson president. A little over 2 centuries later, we now find ourselves in another historic election. I love this cartoon, which is by Chan Lowe of the South Florida Sun-Sentinel and appeared just after Romney announced Ryan as his running mate in August. I love it because it's funny. I love it because it captures the sense that we don't know what to make of the religious dimensions of this election. And I love it because it suggests that even when we're trying to figure out what's going on, we often get it wrong. The 2012 election is certainly a historic election, with both major party tickets featuring candidates from minority religious traditions without a white Protestant in sight, not even for vice president. What is Marge's husband to do? Before pursuing the dynamics of this year's election, it's worth pausing to ask, how is it that we got to the place where we think these things are noteworthy? Its fights from the election of 1800 show our concern with candidates' religious beliefs is not new. Even so, we should not ignore the irony of these concerns, nor assume that they have been constant. The only time religion is explicitly mentioned in the original articles of the Constitution is to officially exclude its significance for candidates seeking office. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. But unofficially, we very much have a popular or informal religious test that any candidate running for president must pass. There are lots of ways we see this religiosity acted out, from taking the oath of office with a hand on the Bible to adding the phrase, "So help me God," to the end of the constitutionally prescribed oath. And both of these traditions, by the way, date back all the way to George Washington, to more recent innovations, such as ending speeches by saying something along the lines of "God bless America," a practice that began with Ronald Reagan. The informal test was obviously evident in 1800 with accusations that Jefferson was an infidel and atheist, and that this somehow disqualified him for being president. And it is more recently evident in the deceptive charge that Obama is a Muslim, with the same implication that this matters or makes him unfit for office, even if it were true. Or to phrase the test in stark terms, what would be the chances for a candidate who declared, "I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist"? Certainly it would be a failing grade on our national religious test. But we're not entirely sure where the cutoff point for that test is. And certainly one of the storylines of this election season is, does Romney's candidacy mean that Mormonism makes the grade? At the same time, it is important to note that this unofficial religious test has not always been consistently applied throughout our history. In fact, it was largely on hiatus from Jefferson's election in 1800 until well into the 20th century. In 1928, Al Smith became the first Catholic to run on a major party ticket. And that election was rife with anti-Catholicism that suggested the election was between Protestantism and America on one side and rum and Romanism on the other. Or more importantly, between the Constitution and the Vatican. The anti-Catholicism was widespread in the press, in cartoons such as this depicting Al Smith as somehow subordinate to Vatican teaching, and extended all the way into speeches made on the floor of the Senate itself against Al Smith Catholicism. But most typically, we point to 1960 as the reemergence of the religious test, or at least the expansion of possible acceptable answers to that test. And though anti-Catholicism was much tamer by 1960, when the Catholic JFK became the Democratic candidate, the nation's readiness for a Catholic president was by no means certain. To counter the persistent questions about his Catholic faith, Kennedy made a famous speech to a room full of Protestant ministers in Houston, Texas. That is, going into the belly of the beast, though he was reluctant and even resentful that he had to do so. Kennedy opened by insisting that the focus on his religion obscured the real issues, and proceeded to use his first paragraph to list those more pressing issues. But he also conceded that since he was Catholic, and no Catholic had been elected president, it is, in his words, apparently necessary for me to state again, not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but what kind of America I believe in. And then he continued, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, and that no Catholic prelate should tell a president what to do, and in a pointed comment to his audience, no Protestant pastor tell his parishioners who to vote for. He insisted that he was not the Catholic candidate for president, but rather the Democratic candidate for president who happened to be Catholic. Jackie Kennedy found this all rather amusing because she said, he's such a poor Catholic after all. Kennedy's speech is an interesting moment in the story of religion and presidential politics. In one sense, it lays to rest the most pressing issue, whether his Catholicism made him unfit for office. When John Kerry ran in 2004, his Catholicism was not an issue, and it is obviously not an issue preventing the vice presidential nominees on the current ticket in this election. But in another sense, Kennedy's vision was not at all realized. For discussions of the candidates' faith and their religious identities have only intensified, and few would now embrace Kennedy's absolute separation of faith and politics. Things did remain mostly quiet until 1976 and the candidacy of Jimmy Carter, the Baptist deacon and Sunday school teacher. 16 years after JFK asked voters not to consider his religious identity and background, Carter proclaimed his born-again Christianity as central to his identity, which helped him win the support of Southern evangelicals and eventually the presidency. But Carter's faith confused many. In response to Carter's declaration that he was born again, an NBC News anchor reported, incidentally, we've checked this out. Being born again is not a bizarre experience of the voice of God from the mountaintop. It's a fairly common experience known to millions of Americans, especially if you're Baptist. But Carter's presidency disappointed most of the evangelicals who had rallied to support Carter as one of their own. And Ronald Reagan played the religion card to capture their support and defeat Carter in 1980. Although divorced and not a regular church member, nor born again, Reagan made a number of shrewd religious moves, such as his announcement while speaking to a meeting of evangelical leaders, I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you. It was met with thunderous applause from the more than 10,000 evangelicals present at that gathering in Dallas. And it was the moment, many have argued, when Reagan sealed the support of the religious right. Reagan's candidacy and presidency marked a sharp rise in God talk, and religion and God became publicly embedded in the presidency. The trend continued with the Southern Baptist but Democratic Bill Clinton, for whom the language of sin and grace came naturally. Notice him there singing in a church service, well, the Methodist Hillary needs the words, Bill knows them by heart. And of course, George W. Bush, who in fact had tutored his father, George H.W. Bush, on God talk, and who spoke often of his Christian faith and the transformative nature of his religious renewal at age 40. Both Bushes were also effective at leveraging religious issues to gain support. And so we have this trajectory creating a conventional wisdom that religious affiliation is an important part of a candidate's identity and strategy, and where religious issues are often key issues during the election season. Until now. Whatever the significance of the candidate's religious affiliation in 2012, we have also witnessed an election that may be historic or at least noteworthy in another regard: the relatively small role that religion has played compared to previous elections. Now, I don't mean to suggest that religion has been absent or unnoticed, but it has not been consistent, constant, or a sustained storyline. It has not defined the candidates, their campaigns, or the commentary about them. To help organize our consideration of the presence or relative absence of religion in the 2012 election, we can think about three categories: the religion of the candidates, religion in the election, and religion of the electorate. First, the religion of the candidates. In thinking about the religion of the candidates themselves, we face another one of this election's contradictions or ironies. Despite the new ground that this election breaks, the candidates' religion has not been a major issue. To understand why this is the case, I want to make what may seem like a counterintuitive claim. As much as we hear arguments about the differences between the candidates, in terms of religion, they are very similar. Lest you now think I lack any credibility as a scholar of American religion, I am not denying that there are substantive and significant differences in the particularities between Romney's Mormonism and the African American liberation context of Obama. I have, in fact, spent much of my scholarly career explicating these two specific religious traditions in America. Rather, what I'm trying to suggest is that the two traditions occupy similar positions on the broader landscape of American religion. As a result, the candidates' seemingly different religious identities play out in similar ways and with similar consequences. As a starting point, faith has played a central role in both of their lives and is central to their self-understanding. Romney is a descendant of persecuted Mormons, a graduate of BYU, a Mormon missionary, a Mormon bishop, and a Mormon president. That's an ecclesiastical term in Mormonism. Obama is a convert to Christianity. Following a secular upbringing, he came to faith in Trinity United Church of Christ, a denomination that descends directly from Puritanism, while working as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. Yet, in a way, I think both men's membership in those traditions or backgrounds is also somewhat unconventional. Romney grew up not in Utah, but in Michigan and has lived in Massachusetts. And Obama grew up in a relatively secular household and did not come to faith until later in his life. I wouldn't want to make too much of those differences, but they do, I think, set them apart from more traditional trajectories in both mid-century Mormonism and African American Christianity. But beyond the general religiosity and its importance in their lives, the particularity of Obama and Romney's religion also shares much in common, for both men's traditions have long been both marginal and misunderstood. The overarching religious category for both men's traditions is outsider. Both Obama and Romney come from traditions that insiders, by which I mean white Protestants, have long depicted as threats to or inconsistent with American identity and values, especially in relationship to American Protestantism. For each candidate, the question about his religion is the same. Is Romney Christian? Is Obama Christian? For Romney, the question is fairly straightforward. Is Mormonism Christianity? 50% of Americans say no. For Obama, the question is a bit more complicated. 51% respond that they don't know or incorrectly identify what Obama's religion is. For some of them, it is a way of saying, I think he's Muslim, which 17% of all Americans and 30% of all Republicans believe. But for the 51% who cannot correctly identify Obama's religion, and even for the 49% who do, many still wonder if the liberation theology and Afrocentric traditions that Obama learned at Trinity, United Church of Christ in Chicago, under Jeremiah Wright, is that really Christianity? Now, as I proceed with this comparison of how Obama and Romney's religion function similarly, notice how the comparison works, whether Obama is understood as Muslim or black Christian, because both religious traditions in America share with Mormonism the experience of being both marginal and misunderstood. Both candidates in their traditions are subject to questions following very predictable patterns in the history of American religious intolerance. Questions that are neither new nor unique in efforts to marginalize and delegitimize religious communities. Questions of loyalty. Do they really love America? Would Romney's loyalty be to church leadership and the Book of Mormon over the Constitution and American national interest? Will Obama advance an African or Muslim agenda over and against U.S. interests? Accusations of secrecy or disingenuousness. What goes on inside those Mormon temples? What are they wearing underneath their clothes? They don't tell us what they really believe, do they? What did Obama really learn under Jeremiah Wright? Why did he have a ring on his finger even before he got married? From sex to money to assertions of brainwashing, the list goes on for both men and both religions, repeating a long pattern of subversive suspicions and conspiratorial theories that have been applied to nearly every non-Protestant tradition in American history. And I should point out, none more so than to Catholics. And here's where the history gets especially interesting. These religious identities not only have parallel experiences, but at times in our history, Mormons have been conflated with African Americans and Muslims. So that they are not just parallel, but actually having shared and conflated experiences of marginalization and misunderstanding. A couple of examples from the height of anti-Mormonism in the late 19th century. In this cartoon here, Uncle Sam's Troublesome Bedfellows, you can see this depiction of what is understood to be threats to the American nation. And there's Uncle Sam in bed with a Native American, a freed slave, and an Irish immigrant with his bottle of whiskey there, a Chinese worker, and a polygamist, a Mormon polygamist on the floor. So all these three things, or five characters, are understood to be one and the same sorts of problems and the same sorts of threats. The Muslim idea is picked up here in this depiction of what a Mormon polygamist understands to be the ideal vision of heaven. And this is playing off both Mormon polygamy and Mormon conceptions of heaven here. But what is the model for understanding the ideal Mormon form of heaven? Well, a Muslim harem. And so once again, Mormonism and Islam, Mormonism and race are being joined together in these sorts of things. Religion and race, in fact, do constitute the two most common ways that America has historically marginalized its own citizens. And when we follow the history of this year's candidates and their traditions, we see how religious and racial othering have been mutually reinforcing categories of marginalization in American history. Independently as well, both Obama's connections to Trinity Church and Romney's Mormon upbringing evoke the nation's troubled racial past and the complicated and often complicit role that churches have played in that history. Both men have been questioned on the racialist dimensions of their church background. On one side, Obama's church background at Trinity in Chicago, under the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, stands as a reminder of the ways that African Americans have long relied upon the black church to resist the humiliation of racism in white churches, to develop and preach a theology that insisted on the equality of all people, and to participate in modes of worship that reach beyond European inheritances. Black churches persist because such needs have not gone away. Obama's March 2008 speech, A More Perfect Union on Race in America, was a direct response to criticisms and questions about his membership at Trinity. On the other side, Romney belongs to and was a missionary for a tradition that represents one of the most enduring patterns of racial exclusion in American history. Denial of full inclusion of people of African descent continued until 1978 in the Mormon Church. Racial inequality was nearly universal in American religion, as the emergence of congregations like Obama's makes clear. So it is important to note that the Mormon practice is noteworthy not for its existence, but for its endurance. Like most Mormons, Romney has not criticized his church for its practices, but he has spoken of his own rejoicing at the announcement of change and of his father's support for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements. One more similarity that I think is worth noting is the views of Obama and Romney on the role of faith in public life. Both candidates gave speech on the topic prior to the 2008 election, and in their speeches, both attempted to walk a similar fine line. Obama's call to renewal speech in 2006 emphasized 2 points. One, the importance of religion, chastising secularists for their insistence that people of faith check their religion at the door. And secondly, the emphasis that any claim of religious faith has to be translated into universal rather than religion-specific language and values. Romney's Faith in America speech in 2007 has often been called his JFK moment, the point in time when he most directly confronted his Mormon identity. And like Kennedy, he asserted that he was a Republican candidate for president rather than a Mormon candidate for president. I should say parallel to Kennedy, not like Kennedy. And he also, similar to Kennedy, asserted that church leaders would have no authority over him as president. But he spent most of his speech arguing against the current extent of separation of church and state and for a larger and bigger role for religion in public life as an intrinsic necessity to the character of the American nation. Religion and freedom go together, he said. Freedom requires religion, just as religion requires freedom. In the end, both argued quite clearly and forcefully for religion to have a role and a voice in the public and political sphere. And while they disagree on many of the particulars of what that role should look like, what is striking, I think, is that in comparison to JFK's speech in 1960, Romney and Obama are much closer to each other than either one of them is to JFK. I mentioned earlier that there is an irony in our being so curious about the candidates' religious backgrounds, since the Constitution prohibits any official religious test for office. And let me wrap up this consideration of the religion of the candidates with another irony about our tendency to scrutinize a candidate's religion. It's a really lousy test. Religious testing has proven a very poor predictor of presidential practice, and like much of the testing we do in America, I think it does not provide the information that we really want. Candidates celebrated for their religious credentials have in actual practice done very little to advance the primary concerns of their religiously motivated base. Jimmy Carter is the most obvious and biggest example. The outspokenly born-again president ended up being the wrong kind of born-again and ended up a huge disappointment. But even Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, conservative heroes that they are, did relatively little in practical and concrete terms to advance the specific issues of their religious base. And quite frankly, this election is not likely to change the pattern. Obama, whose Christianity has long been suspect, has nonetheless, in the frequency of his use of the Bible and his references to Christian faith and theology, outpaced his predecessors. And yet, despite these deeply Christological confessional moments, he has made no effort to enforce religion in general or Christianity in particular during his presidency. And Romney as well appears a mixed verdict. While analysts across the political and religious spectrum have tried to link every dimension of Romney, from his leadership styles to his changing his mind on issues to Mormonism, or to emphasize how they are inconsistent with Mormon teaching, it seems that the best conclusion to draw is that his political ideology and practice is not very tightly bound to his Mormon belief. And so we test our candidates and act as if their religion matters or tells us something, and yet history suggests it doesn't. As one of my students last week put it astutely, religion matters in elections, but not in presidencies. What then of religion in the election? I think this points us to yet another way, in fact, that the candidates are alike. That despite the personal importance of religion to each candidate, neither is talking about it very much or making an issue of their religion. Obama, not at all, and Romney only rarely. When pressed, each man has confirmed his faith and the importance of faith to him personally, but neither one has engaged in much God talk. And even when pressed, has spoken of religion only in the vaguest terms. Romney only recently, and especially notably in the first two elections, speaking of us all being children of the same God. Obama speaks in even vaguer language about the Golden Rule. This is not to say that others have not made an issue of Romney's or Obama's religion. Around the fringe, there's been quite a bit of chatter, trying to resuscitate the Jeremiah Wright flap or to insist on Obama's true Muslim identity and agenda. And likewise, there have been plenty on both the far right and the far left who've tried to raise concerns about Romney's Mormonism. Mormonism as unchristian or a threat to American identity. My Google alerts have been filled with such notices, and I look forward with relish to turning those alerts off tonight. But those notices largely come from peripheral voices and sources. They have not gained a consistent, coherent, or sustained traction. So why, as those who analyze such things tell us, has there been less God talk than in recent elections, and even a noticeable decline in visits to churches and religious sites? I think at one level it's topical. There are more pressing issues, particularly the economy, which even in polling about religion are consistently the number one concern. As another one of my students, I thought, so poignantly articulated it, in 2008 we wanted a Messiah. In 2012 we want an accountant. But there are, I think, also reasons more directly related to religion. Clearly, both candidates do not want to make this an issue. At one level, few doubt the religiosity of each man, even though they may not know what it is. But at this basic level, then, each candidate has passed a basic threshold on that unofficial religious test. They're not an atheist. But at a deeper level, each man would be mad to make religious identity an issue. It would be a form of mutually assured destruction. And so each is unlikely to make the first move in that direction. The marginal and misunderstood character of each man's religion means that neither has anything to gain by drawing attention to religion. According to a Pew poll, less than 50% of Americans say they are comfortable with either Romney or Obama's religion. Just 41% are comfortable with Romney's faith commitments, and 45% are comfortable with Obama's. So any mention of each man's religion is likely to alienate more than it would win over. Another way to say this is that in voting for presidents, voters tend to prefer someone who is like them. And religiously speaking, more than half of American voters believe that Romney and Obama have religious beliefs different than their own. They're not like me. The most common use of God talk in electoral politics has been to whip up support among white evangelical Protestants, the biggest bloc of religion voters, but on the basis of a shared religious identity. And neither presidential candidate and neither vice presidential candidate, for that matter, can even pretend to share this identity, and none of them want to draw attention to this fact. Another reason, I think, is that nothing new has really emerged since the 2000 election season. During that time, both candidates had to very directly confront their own religion and how it would play out in the electorate. But not much has changed on the religious front for either one of them. Primaries may be another key when considering the role of religion or the lack thereof. It appears of late that primaries are the prime locus where candidates work out their religion issues, and by extension, where they use up and wear out their God talk. During the Republican primaries this year, those most trumpeting religious identities, Rick Perry, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum, flamed out pretty badly. In addition, both polling and pundits suggest that even for Romney, his Mormonism was more of a primary than a general election issue. Now, in my next observation, I may be giving credit where none is due, because I think politicians have a highly underdeveloped sense of irony and an inability to acknowledge contradiction. But maybe, just maybe, Republicans realize they cannot criticize Obama's religion on the one hand and paint themselves as defenders of religious freedom and constitutional liberty on the other. And maybe, just maybe, Democrats realize they cannot simultaneously celebrate diversity and criticize the diversity that their opponent chooses. And finally, in thinking why the candidates have not made religion an issue, I think we are getting a glimpse of the future. In the turn towards more precise and targeted campaigning based on a wealth and frighteningly personal amount of demographic data, campaigning is largely happening out of our view, particularly for those of us living in California and outside of swing states. So that religion is still being used to parse and persuade some groups of voters, and both campaigns do have offices and personnel dedicated to faith-based outreach. But it is so precise and so targeted, unless we are that target or mistakenly taken for one, we're not likely to see it. I have no doubt that the three people sitting in their basement in Ohio who are going to determine the outcome of this election have been approached on the basis of their religion. With all that said, I do think that one of the biggest religion stories, such as it is in this election, will be the conservative Christian support of a Mormon candidate. This is the story of a non-issue. It turns out that political ideology trumped theological purity, even for those who last year, or even last month, in the case of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, those who labeled Mormonism a cult were willing to overlook that characterization, as one evangelical leader after another endorsed Romney. It is a story, to be sure, and a story whose twists and turns have intensified in the final week, and whose enduring significance remains to be seen, but it is worth knowing that mitigating the religion issue is nonetheless a religion story. Surveying the now concluding religion cycle, religion seems not to have been much of an issue. That is, religious issues have not figured prominently. Even something like religious liberty, which got a fair amount of lip service as the primary season was winding down, has not gotten much play. Romney has not taken the bishop's bait on this one. At the same time, thanks to some major stumbles by Senate candidates like Todd Akin and Richard Murdoch on abortion, Romney has had to create some distance from this issue, further enabling Democrats to claim that this is a health care and women's issue rather than a religious one. But perhaps the greatest evidence that religion is not an issue in this campaign is a comparison with the 2008 election season, when Rick Warren of Saddleback Church in Southern California was a major figure in political and religious dialogue in the political arena, and in fact in August of 2008 hosted a civic forum. It was a faith forum in which he invited both candidates to come on and talk about issues of religion. Once again, Rick Warren attempted to hold such a forum this election season, but no go. His phone calls were not even returned. Our final group of consideration is the electorate itself. And despite any late-breaking religious chatter, I do think that the real religion story this election is not about the candidates. It is not about particular issues, but it is about the religion of voters themselves. In fact, the electorate itself may be yet another major reason for the diminished role of religion in this election. Now, this is not to say that religion isn't important in how people decide to vote, but rather to suggest that the changing religious character of the electorate and its increasing complexity means that it's harder to play to in religious terms and to make generalized religious talk and makes generalized religious talk and religious issues less effective. In fact, I think if we want to talk about what's most interesting in terms of religion, I'm increasingly convinced that this is it, rather than the candidate's religion or religious issues, though it is the least nuanced and understood, and this may further explain why it's not getting much attention. The basic narrative is that things are going according to typical patterns. And at one level, that's true. White evangelicals continue to favor the Republican candidate in large numbers. Black Protestants favor the Democratic candidate in even larger numbers, and the Catholic vote once again swings back and forth in between them. But deeper down, some interesting things are going on that start to complicate and to qualify these analyses. Let's start with the big one getting lots of attention. White Catholics, swing voters. At nearly a quarter of the population, Catholics are theoretically the nation's largest religious political demographic. But that identification tells us almost nothing politically. Even for those claiming that their views and choices are deeply influenced by their Catholic faith, it doesn't really get us anywhere to understand how they might vote. Our vice presidential slate, I think, is a very clear demonstration of this, where we have two candidates who speak of the importance of their Catholic faith and how it informs their political stances, but nonetheless end up in opposition on almost every issue. And then we have bishops in the pulpit who are preaching and nuns on the bus who are protesting. But even these contradictions still don't get us very far. Observant white Catholics are heavily Republican, while nominal Catholics lean Democratic, and those prized swing voters, moderate white Catholics, end up being only about 1/3 of Catholic voters, and their voting mirrors that of the general population, all of which suggests that the Catholic part of Catholic voters tells us very little and is probably not a significant factor influencing their vote. Things like race, class, and geography are likely more significant factors in understanding and predicting their voting habits. So let's dig a little deeper underneath some of these labels and see what starts to emerge. And as we do, we begin to find ourselves back in the complicated intersections of religion and race, an intersection that is one of the most enduring themes in American religion. Taken as a whole, white Catholics lean Republican, while Latino Catholics are heavily Democratic. But now let's shift the conversation slightly from Catholic to Latino. In the 2008 election, 9.5% of the electorate was Latino, almost twice the size of Jewish, Muslim, and Asian American voters combined, and concentrated in either swing states or states that are rich electorally. Latinos are mostly Catholic, and those that are, as I just noted, lean heavily Democratic. In fact, in 2008, 1/4 of Democratic votes came from Latinos. But now consider this. 25% of the Latino electorate is now conservative Protestant. Latino Protestants vote in higher numbers than Latino Catholics, and they are voting increasingly Republican, up from 21% in 1996 to 44% in 2004. And as we move into other groups not getting attention, as so often is the case, it remains deeply intertwined with race. Let me give just one more example here. Asian Americans. An interesting example. Asian Americans have much higher rates of non-affiliation, both religiously, you see here 26% compared to 19% religiously unaffiliated in the American population, and equally higher rates of unaffiliation politically. 16% of Asian American voters do not affiliate with a particular party, compared with 6% in the general electorate. Now, all these statistics become even more significant when we consider that the numbers of white Christians and of Protestants are shrinking. In a poll released just last month, for the first time ever, the number of Protestants in the United States is just under 50%, minimizing their influence and making these other trends I've just noted all the more significant, but all the more complicated in determining how to make a religious appeal to voters. Now, the issue that has perhaps gotten the most attention is the nuns. And here we are talking about not the ones on the bus, but the ones that don't go to church. The nuns are, I think, the most significant religious development, not just politically, but nationally, and may be a very important factor in both campaigns, but especially Obama's decision to minimize their God talk. It is the fastest growing religious affiliation in the United States right now, and it is also the largest religious bloc that supports Obama. But it's also a complicated story. This is not a unified group. The atheists are particularly politically involved. But the rest of the folks there, the atheists and the agnostics together are just under 5%. The rest of this group, sort of the spiritual but not religious in some way, shape, or form, is 15% of this unaffiliated group, and they tend not to be very politically involved, much less so than the general population. And to add to that, this whole group tends to be younger, and younger folks tend to be less politically involved. And so it becomes this very complicated strategy to think about for candidates, particularly Democrats, as they have to balance secular and religious constituencies. And I think we saw an example of that in the Democratic National Convention, where the platform originally made no reference to God, and then in response to outcry against that, they voted to put it back in on the floor, but in a vote that was by no means clearly in the affirmative. So you can see here now a schematic of each candidate's religious constituencies and how complicated that religious mosaic is for each candidate. And when you consider the fact that the number of Protestants and Christians is declining, it's still above 70%, but it's going down. It suggests that this challenge and this increasingly diversified electorate will only continue as we move into the future. These questions about the electorate, in fact, may be the best indication of where we're heading and the complicated road that this presents for candidates who have traditionally been expected to highlight religion. On the one hand, Obama has had the harder task of managing support among a vast and diverse group of religions, but I think his challenge is increasingly the challenge of both parties in the future. Indeed, it will be interesting to see, as this 2012 presidential election moves from current event to history, we hope very soon, what other significance it holds or benchmarks it might become in the story of religion and politics in the United States. On one side, the election seems to confirm the alliance between the GOP and conservative Christianity of both the Protestant and Catholic variety, and that alliance is strong as ever. But I think that alliance also looks increasingly desperate. The GOP has not nominated a satisfactorily born-again candidate for the last 2 election cycles, and that constituency is, in fact, a shrinking part of the electorate. And while there is the movement of Catholics into the GOP camp, as we've seen, it's far from uniform, and it is, quite frankly, unclear how much influence Catholic leaders have over their American flock. And insecure younger voters, even when they lean to the right, seem less motivated by the issues at the core of the religious right. And the declining percentage of the electorate that evangelicals constitute means that we're becoming increasingly a less Christian nation, a less religiously literate nation, and a less biblically literate nation, which will only further complicate appeals to religion. But perhaps this election will also mark a greater inclusiveness in the unofficial religious tests to which we subject our presidential candidates, moving us closer to realizing the words of the Constitution that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification for political office. Whether or not Romney wins, the immediate beneficiary appears to be Mormonism. Perhaps Mormons in the public sphere will experience less discrimination. That said, we would do well to recognize that just as electing our first African American president has not eradicated racism, neither will the nomination and perhaps election of a first religious outsider suddenly eliminate religious discrimination, even as we can hope that it moves us a step closer. And so as we ponder the declining religious rhetoric and God talk this time around, we are left to wonder whether this election marks a turning point, signaling a new direction or at least a declining role of the explicitly religious rhetoric in electoral politics. It remains to be seen whether this is a trend or an aberration, but especially when we consider the nation's changing religious demographics, they suggest that in looking ahead, moderating God talk may be the prudent political choice. Thank you. So I'm tired of talking, but we have some time, I think, for conversation. So questions, comments, observations especially? Yeah.
Jim, I really appreciate your discussion of the American context, or sort of internal domestic context. I'm wondering if some of the foreign policy topics that have come up in the debates, for example, might be serving as kind of proxies for a sort of veiled debate about religion. I'm thinking of Romney's charge of the apology tour to Muslim countries that Obama embarked on at the outset of his presidency. And I'm thinking of Romney's own trip to Israel and his positioning himself on an issue dear not just to conservatives but to Christian evangelicals in his outstated support for Israel.
Yeah, the question was, is foreign policy debate and statements about foreign policy a veiled way of talking about religious issues? I think particularly as it came up in the third debate, which was focused on foreign policy. Yeah, I think it is. And I think a lot, God talk may be down in this election, but it's right there beneath the surface, And so much of our language and thinking, because of our history, is inflected with this religiously oriented language. And so I think you're right. It is very easy to tap into that even without using explicitly religious language. And so I don't doubt that characterizing Obama's foreign policy and travel as an apology tour is one way to try to evoke that Muslim identity again. And of course, there's a complicated Jewish vote in relationship to Israel, where Jews tend to lean Democratic, but the foreign policy of Republicans is often more appealing in how that's handled. And so that may very well have been an appeal to a particular electorate. Yeah.
Is there any significance in the relationship between Paul Ryan and Ayn Rand with regard to this topic?
I would prefer to ask him that question. I presume that is there a relationship between Ayn Rand and Paul Ryan here? What's going on in that? Ayn Rand being a staunchly atheist in her political philosophy, and Ryan lifting up his own Catholicism. He's really had to backtrack on that. I think that has, when we talk about what does this Catholicism mean, and we see these two vice presidential candidates, I think that just becomes one more piece of evidence that the Catholic piece of that ends up not telling us very much. And I think the complicated ways, in parallel ways to sort of the Mormon cult question and evangelical Christians, and can we vote for a Mormon that we thought was a cult. These pieces are being shifted around so that the political pieces come to one side and the religious pieces get shunted off to the other. And I think it's part of that sort of moving around that's going on. Yeah.
Right now in Congress, there's only one member who says that he's openly atheist, like, I believe there is no God. With the God talk going down, do you foresee more people of no faith or of openly professing a disbelief in faith whatsoever being elected?
I suspect that it will continue to work its way. I'm sorry. The question was that with one atheist in Congress, what's the likelihood of non-believers and atheists becoming elected to office in the future? And I would suggest that the congressperson is the model, that these sorts of changes tend to happen from the bottom up, and only once they have sufficiently reached across a wide variety of congressional and local offices will someone be able to run on a national platform there. But I think it happens in local, smaller districts before it can happen at a national level. Way in the back.
I recognize this is going to be kind of an inside baseball Catholic question, but what's your, I'd just like to hear your insights about the two vice presidential candidates. You have Joe Biden, who knows and understands the Catholic intellectual tradition that's behind the Catholic social teaching, and in my judgment, Paul Ryan does not. And I'm not trying to get into their internal states of mind, but when pushed on Catholic social teaching and the intellectual landscape, Ryan doesn't have the skills and the knowledge that Biden has. What do you think about that? Recognizing that you're a Presbyterian, recognize religion. No, but I recognize that it's inside baseball, but it is your area.
So the question is about the Catholicism of the two vice presidential candidates, their understanding of that, and particularly Catholic social teaching, and Biden and Ryan articulating that in very different ways. I think as an outsider to this question, I think it represents the way, I think it's analogous to the way Christians as a whole read the Bible. We all pick and choose. We all make claims about what the Bible says. what the Bible says the most, what's most important in the Bible. Right? And this, particularly within Protestantism, this is the way that we fight our battles. The Bible says this. No, the Bible says that. You know, as Abraham Lincoln famously said, both sides read the same Bible, both sides prayed to the same God, and they couldn't both be right. And I think it looks like to me that folks are picking and choosing elements of the Catholic tradition and Catholic voices that they're hearing and saying, this is what Catholicism is, this is what Catholicism is. I think the significance on the American landscape is I think we really are having a debate, and I think this is a live question. What does it mean to be Catholic? And what the answer to that question is and how you answer that question. I think that's a live question, and that's one that's important. I think that's one that's fascinating to look at, and that's one that will have a significant impact in all these different sort of subgroups within the Catholic electorate, because they're answering that question in different ways.
Do you think this would change any if at some point in time, which hopefully will be in my lifetime, that we'll have a woman that will be a candidate for president? Because there's a lot of religious traditions that believe there's a place for women, and it certainly isn't in this place, and it certainly isn't in the place of the church. Women should be submissive. Women can't be elders. Women can't be pastors and leaders. Certainly that has changed in some religious communities, but not in a lot. They still hold on to their strong male tradition. So do you think this would cause some problems in the future if we had a woman as president or running for presidency?
So the question is, if we have a woman as a candidate or president, will this change? Oh, that'll change everything, right? It will be interesting to see, because there are very gender dimensions to religion, right? And I talked a lot about the intersection of religion and race today and the way these things come together. Well, religion and gender is another really important dimension, and how that will play out. So I have no doubt that will add complexity to that mix, and depending on what voice that comes from. I think having a female Republican candidate might look very different than having a female Democratic candidate too. I mean, there's so many aspects to this, but yeah, I think it can't not be significant.
Jim, we've heard a lot from you about your study of this and your background, and I also know that you are yourself a person of faith, and I'd be curious if you wanted to say a little bit about what you would like to see the role of religion be in the presidential election.
Oh, I have a lot that I could say. Look, I think that it has a place. I think that it has a place for candidates, and I think it has a place for voters. I can't imagine being a person of faith and that not informing how I would vote. I can't imagine being a candidate. Well, I can't imagine being a candidate. But hypothetically speaking, I can't imagine running for office and not having my faith perspective inform my views on issues without necessarily meaning that I would articulate them that way. So I think there's a place for that. But I am also very concerned about the way that religion plays in our religious culture. And I think when religion is most explicit, it's actually often most absent. And that is that when we confuse political positions and political parties for religion, I don't think that's faithful. I think that when we use religion to condemn to eternal damnation our political opponents, I don't think that's faithful. I think when we claim to know the will of God, I think that's exchanging politics for religion. And in my tradition, that's idolatry. Right? But there's an upside too. And in 1630, with the Puritans, John Winthrop came across and said that we are a chosen nation, that God is with us. Now, I think there's a lot theologically and historically problematic with taking that claim. But he said we have a covenant with God. We have a covenant. We're doing something bigger than ourselves. This is not just about us. And when we do that, God doesn't promise us blessings no matter what. God holds us accountable to what we do. And along with the possibility of blessings come curses. And what Winthrop said, even the Puritan Winthrop said, you know what the best measure of whether or not we're doing our job is? It's whether we mutually forbear one another in love, no matter how we act or what we believe. I think that's worth thinking about. And when we think about William Penn and Roger Williams, great thinkers in religious liberty, and we think about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, great thinkers in religious liberty, we have something that is intrinsic to what it means to have faith in America as well. Not religious liberty for ourselves, but religious liberty to others. When we protect it not for our own and for those who are loudest and biggest, but we're for those who can't speak for themselves and those who are smallest. When we extend religious liberty with grace and mercy to others, then I think we are upholding the greatest ideals, not just of faith, but of our history. I told you I was going to go up, but yeah, I think there is much to say there. Yeah.
I'm wondering what you think about Biden's position on women's right for choice. I mean, he practically said, I'm setting aside my Catholic upbringing, the teaching of the Catholic Church, and I support women in their right to choose. What do you think about that?
So the question...
Do you think it was a political thing, or do you think he was sincere?
The question is about Biden and his support for women's choice. And was that political or was it sincere? Can it be both? But that's another one of this moment of Catholicism and the vice presidential candidates, right? You had, this very direct question about this, and Paul Ryan says, sort of, this is what my faith teaches me, and I can't do anything but insist that that's what happens in the public sphere. And then you had Joe Biden, who says, this is what my faith teaches, and I accept that teaching. But I also understand in the political arena, I can't force my religious beliefs on others. So I think he's trying to do that sort of that translation. I hold this belief, but I have to be able to translate what I believe into publicly accessible or universal values. And so I think, there's very sort of two models for thinking about faith in public life there.
I mean, there's no way to know for sure, but do you admire him taking that position?
I am glad, she said, do I admire him taking that position? I said, I'm glad that I'm not on the hot seat where I have to make that.
Do we have time for one more question? We always try to privilege students in the last question. You can call on one of your own students since you brought them here.
Maybe there's extra credit for asking a question, huh?
Okay, then I'm going to be able to ask a question. I thought it was interesting how you said religion is an issue in the primaries. It seems, at least this year, it seems to have dropped out in the general election. And as you looked at the United States Catholic bishops in the summertime, there was a very strong kind of like campaign, right, for religious liberty, and that seems to have dropped out. Do you have any? And just in the context of what you were saying about it being much more of an issue for primary, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah. I think there was this momentum in the primary, coming out of the primary, that religion was an issue that was getting traction, that people were talking about. And you did have everyone from Rick Perry to Mitt Romney picking up the religious liberty sort of train. It came at the end of the primary season there, and we sort of got the summer lull. So I think that's one factor. And I do think that just as the election season came into full swing after the convention, that candidates really made a very deliberate issue not to make religion an issue. And that was part of that they would let some surrogates raise that, but they would not make that, it would not be a productive issue for them.
Jim, let me, we have had, although you haven't been able to come, this has been a series of really excellent lectures, and yours has been a really wonderful, worthy end to that. So thank you very much, especially for really adding texture to our thinking about religion in the public sphere, and particularly in the election. How much race, geography, economic level, that is really part of the mix too. and as well as for getting us to imagine whether the future is going to be a very different future for us in religion and politics. So thank you very much for coming. Just a few pieces of business. Lectures are free of charge. Anyone who would like to make a donation, there is an opportunity for you outside. These feedback cards have been extremely helpful to us as we've been putting together these series, so I would ask you to fill them out as you leave. Next quarter, we have had an excellent series this quarter on sacred politics. Next quarter, the Ignatian Center is moving to the issue of sacred dialogue. I think at all of your places you have kind of posters of what we're having next quarter, and it's going to be on how sacred texts of a diversity of religious traditions are used, embodied, employed, interpreted, and celebrated. So I really want to encourage you to come back next quarter. One final thing before we thank our lecturer once more is today is the election day. The polls are open until 8 o'clock. And so I would heartily encourage you, if you have not voted, to exercise your right to vote, because it is an immense privilege. Let us thank Jim Bennett one more time.
There are some who have been on the inside of the religious right. I think I keep saying that that's the largest single unified bloc, in terms of advocacy and that sort of thing. Who say that once Republican politicians realize that they could gain support for this segment of the population, then those religious leaders started getting a gotcha for the power of the access to the party. probably sort of in my own research, that would be the one thing that I feel like I can say very confidently. There was a shift there that sort of ideology got them in, but then once they tasted it, it became. Because if you're unravel like Elizabeth Park, like not reading, right? You had been kind of this proponent for this sort of ideological around a person and other things. You see that the Jews are kind of business, Christian conservatives, and others go out for try gambling interests and other things. And so that's why I'm just curious, like, oh, I'm sure it's there. Yeah, I'm sure it's there. I can't speak authoritatively. Yeah. I suspect it's there. And having been on the inside, you know that. Right? How things, that is how things work.
We never get into that kind of stuff, but I appreciate it. Thank you very much. That was great.
I was so, like, when you were up here talking, I was like, okay, and then, like, you didn't seem like you were enjoying it at all.
Oh, really?
I don't know, and then, like, when you get to the question and answer, it's just like, a lot more natural for you, like.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, as you know, I don't usually stand behind a podium.
Yeah, that's
and read,
what
but it was just too much.
I was just surprised when you were just up there. I was like, you seem out of place.
Yeah, it's not where I'd like to be, but there was just no way I could have done it that much without notes. So.
I guess, hey, just maybe thanks again for lectures or this. Just a question that I do want to ask, but I want to hog the questions. Do you think that Nixon maybe elected under today's religious test standards? He was a Quaker.
He was a Quaker.
Like the least observant Quaker I can think of.
Yeah. It's an interesting question.
It's interesting because you don't see too many Quakers in politics.
No, you don't. Herbert Hoover was a Quaker too.
Well, yeah, but like Hoover, like affirmed the oath rather than swearing the oath like Nixon did. So.
Yeah.
About Quaker.
Yeah, you know, I think it all depends on how you present it. I think Quaker obviously qualifies on the religious test.
Okay.
It's not a failing grade on it, but. So I guess it's hard to disentangle Nixon the man and Nixon the Quaker, but I think Nixon the Quaker probably could. That would be my hunch.
All right. So. Well, thanks again, and hopefully I'll see you around the department more, just as long as I'm not, barging in inopportune moments.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let me,
So was that the bait you were offering?
yeah.
I was like,
She
oh
said she had
shoot, but
seen
I
the
don't have
more
my notes in front
developed
of me.
You did very well. Diana Gibson goes, "Woo, he switched into preacher mode." And I said, "I know he wanted to."
You did.
In a good way. In a good way.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah.
Well done.
Thank you for that.
I have to run off to Bible study now.
Okay. I'll see you briefly tomorrow at least.
Yeah. 3 out of 4 days in a row. That's
Yeah.
pretty good.
Yeah. Amy's heard this a lot.
Yeah, I know. That's what she said. She was kind of priming you for the part 2.
Very
yeah.
helpful. Very helpful.
No, I appreciated that question and response too. So, how was your process in preparing for this? Is this like, do you feel like this is kind of old hat for you, or did it take you to a different place yourself?
It took me to a different place because I really am a historian. So, and I spent a lot of time in history. I mean, that's sort of the way I could make sense of things.
Yeah.
So,
no, I appreciated that.
which is why one of my students was like, you didn't seem like yourself. You were standing behind that podium, and then you came out with the questions, and it's too much sort of not in my pocket kind of material to just go out there and do it without. But it was fun to be able to think about it. It was actually really fun to be able to think about this stuff. So, I
Yeah, no, it
appreciated
was
the
neat to
chance
see
to do
each
that.
person how they did it differently. I don't know if you've had a chance to see their online, so you can.
I started watching and I thought, you know what?
No,
This is
wait
going to
till
make
we're
it
done.
worse
Yeah.
rather than better. I'm just
Yeah.
going to wait because
Yeah.
I've heard really great things about them.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to wait till I'm done
Yeah.
before I look at these things.
But it is neat because, I mean, Kitty would be, example of that, like, okay, so she got us into, like, Roman practices of grain sharing. Like, she began with kind of giving Romney and Ryan the floor. And so therefore, when we kind of entered into this deep study of this particular text or in this particular time, like we were all like, yes, please tell. It's really incredible. I think that's what I appreciate too, that there's that.
password on the thing in St. Clair for the, do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I'm trying to click on the screen, but then it says like password. Not necessarily the computer, but for the system, like where the recording is, and then like the thing, like say you want to adjust the camera, like that one. Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna double check. Like, did all I have to do is press stop and then it's already recorded on it? Oh, okay. Yeah, I already checked on the. Okay, just making sure. All right, I'll be there.